The fine was sitting in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a heating oil advertisement and a Christmas card from my sister in Florida. I remember thinking, as I stood there in my driveway in boots that were already soaked through from the overnight snowfall, that nothing good ever came in a plain white envelope with the Maplewood Ridge HOA logo stamped in the upper left corner. I was right. I opened it right there in the cold, fingers going numb, breath fogging up in front of my face, and I read the words that would kick off what I can only describe as the most ridiculous 3 weeks of my adult life. Dear resident Daniel Sawyer, it has come to the attention of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association that on December 14th, a service vehicle and its personnel created unauthorized disturbances to the shared community snow path located along the eastern boundary of lots 7 through 12. Specifically, said personnel left footprints and vehicle tracks that compromised the groomed appearance of the path. Per Section 11, Subsection 4C of the Maplewood Ridge HOA Community Standards and Enforcement Bylaws, this constitutes a violation of shared property aesthetics. A fine of $175 has been assessed to your account. I stood there in the cold for probably a full 30 seconds just staring at that paper. Footprints. I was being fined $175 for footprints in the snow. Let me back up and explain what actually happened, because the situation was a lot more understandable than the fine made it sound, and also a lot more infuriating once you understood the full picture. I live in Maplewood Ridge, a small planned community in western Pennsylvania. It's a nice enough neighborhood. 34 homes, a shared walking path that runs along the eastern edge of the development, a small gazebo nobody ever uses, and a set of community rules that, if you printed them out and stacked the pages, would probably hit you at roughly the same height as a golden retriever. The neighborhood is genuinely lovely in winter. Old oak trees, wide yards, houses with front porches, the kind of place where the first heavy snowfall makes everything look like a greeting card. It would be perfect if it weren't for Janet Covington. Janet Covington, where do I even begin? Janet had lived in Maplewood Ridge longer than almost anyone. She was maybe 55, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed even when she was just checking her mail, and she had been on the HOA board for the better part of 8 years. She'd been treasurer, secretary, and currently held the self-appointed title of Community Standards Enforcement Chairperson, which was a role she had literally created and lobbied for herself at a board meeting 3 years ago. The title gave her exactly 0 additional authority under the actual HOA bylaws, but nobody had wanted to fight her about it at the time, and so it stuck. Janet walked around the neighborhood like a zoning inspector on a power trip, which was basically exactly what she was, except without the training or the legal authority. The thing about Janet was that she had a very specific idea about how Maplewood Ridge should look at all times, and winter was her busiest season. In her mind, the shared snow path, this roughly 6-foot-wide walkway that ran along the eastern boundary of the neighborhood, had to look pristine at all times. She had pushed the board to hire a local landscaping company, Greenfield Outdoor Services, to come in twice a week during snowfall season and groom the path with a small snow blower. They would pack it smooth, clear the edges, and leave it looking like something from a ski resort brochure. And honestly, it did look nice. I'll give her that. The problem was that the path ran right along the back edge of lots 7 through 12, and my house was on lot 8. My propane tank sat at the back of my property, about 40 feet from the house, accessed via a service easement that ran right alongside that shared path. When the propane delivery truck came, the driver, a guy named Roy who I'd known for 4 years and who was as friendly and professional as anyone you'd ever meet, had to walk from the truck to the tank along that easement. Which meant in the middle of a December snowfall, he left boot prints in the snow alongside the path, not on the path itself, alongside it. But some of those prints were close enough to the edge that Janet, who had apparently been watching from her house, which was on lot 10, decided this was a federal offense. Now here's what made this situation genuinely urgent and not just annoying. We'd had a brutal stretch of weather in early December. Two back-to-back storms had dumped about 14 inches on us over 5 days. Temperatures had dropped to the single digits at night, and my propane tank had been running low for longer than I liked. I have a propane furnace, a propane water heater, and a propane fireplace, and when it's 9 degrees outside, those things are not optional. I'd called the propane company, Valley Fuel Services, and they'd told me deliveries were backed up because of the road conditions and the volume of calls. When Roy finally showed up on December 14th, I was genuinely relieved. The tank was under 15%. I'd been stretching it, turning down the thermostat overnight, sleeping in extra layers. When Roy knocked on my door to let me know he'd filled the tank, I almost hugged the guy. He walked out there in the snow, did his job, came back, and that was that. He was there for maybe 20 minutes, and he was careful and professional the whole time. The footprints he left were in the snow along the service easement, not on the groomed path, adjacent to it. And Janet Covington fined me $175 for it. I'll be honest about my first reaction, which was not mature or measured. I went inside, put the fine letter on the kitchen table, made coffee, and sat down and said several words that I'm not going to repeat here. Then I called my neighbor Phil Davison on Lot 9, who'd been around as long as Janet and who had watched her pull these kinds of stunts for years, and I read him the fine letter over the phone. Phil was quiet for a second and then said, very calmly, "Dan, she cited Section 11, subsection 4C. That section is about lawn decoration guidelines. It doesn't have anything to do with the path." I told him I thought that sounded about right. Phil said, "Don't pay it, not yet. Come talk to me tonight." Phil Davison was a retired civil engineer, 71 years old, and the kind of man who had 3 filing cabinets full of organized documents in his basement. He had kept a personal copy of every version of the Maplewood Ridge HOA bylaws since he moved in 16 years ago. He had filed 7 formal objections to HOA decisions over the years, winning 5 of them outright and getting the other 2 partially reversed on appeal. He was quiet, patient, methodical, and he absolutely could not stand Janet Covington, not because of personal animosity, but because, as he put it, she treats the rules as a weapon, and that's the opposite of what rules are for. Phil was my favorite person in the neighborhood. I went over to Phil's that evening. The temperature had dropped again, probably down to 12 or 13 degrees, and the walk from my driveway to his front door felt like crossing a parking lot in the Arctic. His porch light was on, and his front walk was meticulously cleared and salted, classic Phil. He met me at the door in a wool sweater and handed me a mug of coffee before I'd even gotten both boots off, and then we sat down at his kitchen table and looked at the fine together. Phil had already pulled out the relevant sections of the bylaws. Section 11, subsection 4C, as he'd said on the phone, was titled Seasonal Exterior Decoration Standards, and was entirely about holiday lights, lawn ornaments, and inflatables. It had absolutely nothing to do with the shared snow path. The shared path was governed by Section 8, which covered common area maintenance, and specifically Section 8, subsection 2A, which noted that residents were responsible for ensuring that contractors and service personnel accessing their properties via the service easements did so in a manner consistent with reasonable care for adjacent common areas. Phil tapped the page. "Reasonable care," he said. Roy was walking. He wasn't driving a forklift across the path. He was walking next to it. "That's reasonable care." I agreed completely, but here was the more interesting part that Phil had dug up. The fine itself, under the HOA's enforcement procedures in Article 14, was only authorized after a written warning had been issued and a response period of 10 business days had been allowed, except in cases of immediate health or safety hazards. Janet, or whoever had pushed this through, had skipped the warning entirely and gone straight to the fine. That was a procedural violation of the HOA's own rules. I asked Phil why Janet would do something that sloppy, and he leaned back in his chair and said, "Because she's been doing this long enough that people just pay. She counts on people not reading the bylaws." He said in the past 2 years alone, he knew of at least 6 fines that had been issued the same way: wrong citation, no prior warning, or both. Most people had just paid because $150 or $175 didn't feel worth fighting over and they didn't want the hassle. I thought about that and felt the kind of slow-building anger that's worse than the quick kind, because it's harder to let go of. I told Phil I was going to contest the fine. He nodded like he'd been expecting me to say exactly that and slid a piece of paper across the table. He'd already drafted a formal written objection for me. Of course he had. The next morning I submitted the formal written objection by email to the HOA board, copying all 5 board members individually, and I attached 3 things. First, the fine notice. Second, Phil's breakdown of the incorrect bylaw citation and the procedural violation. Third, 3 photographs I'd taken the morning after Roy's visit showing the service easement, the distance between the footprints and the actual edge of the groomed path, and the fact that the path itself was still perfectly intact. Those photos were time-stamped. They were clear. They showed exactly what had happened and exactly what hadn't happened. I hit send and went back to my coffee and waited. I didn't wait long. By 11 that morning, I had a response from Janet Covington directly. And when I say response, I mean a wall of text that opened with, "Dear Mr. Sawyer, your objection has been noted. However, the board stands behind the assessment," and then proceeded to misquote the bylaw again and add new language about the visual integrity of community spaces that did not appear anywhere in the actual bylaws. She also, helpfully, mentioned that continued non-payment would result in additional fees being added to my account. Now, up to this point, I'd been handling this calmly, but something about that email clicked something into place for me. Janet wasn't backing down because she was confident she was right. She was doubling down because she'd gotten away with it before. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought about those 6 other fines Phil had mentioned, and I decided that this wasn't just about my $175 anymore. I called the other 5 residents Phil had mentioned as having paid questionable fines. I found most of them by just asking Phil who they were, and the other through a conversation at the neighborhood's shared mailbox cluster one afternoon. 2 of them were older retired couples who had paid without much thought because they hadn't wanted the stress. One was a young family, the Petersons on Lot 4, who had paid a $200 fine over leaving their garbage bins at the curb an hour past the pickup window, because a work emergency had prevented them from bringing them in on time. One was Marcus Webb on Lot 13, who'd been fined for having salt bags visible near his front door during an ice storm, not for having them out indefinitely, but because they were there during a specific period when Janet had decided the neighborhood needed to look clean for a real estate, showing she was facilitating for a neighbor. And the last one was a woman named Carol Briggs on Lot 20, who had been fined for having tire tracks in her driveway after a plowing service came early in the morning. Tire tracks in a driveway that she owned outright, in a driveway that had nothing to do with the shared path or any common area. I sat with all of this information for about 2 days, organizing it, thinking through the best approach. I was not, I want to be clear, someone with a legal background. I was a 43-year-old guy who managed logistics for a regional distribution company. But I dealt with enough contracts and disputes in my professional life to understand that documentation and procedure mattered enormously, and I was beginning to think that what Janet had been doing was not just annoying. It was potentially fraudulent. She was collecting fines on behalf of the HOA under false or incorrect citations, and she'd been doing it consistently enough that it looked like a pattern, not a series of mistakes. I talked this through with Phil, and he agreed. He also pointed out something I hadn't thought of yet: The fines collected by the HOA were supposed to go into the general community fund and be documented in the board's financial reports. The board issued quarterly financial summaries to all residents, and Phil had every one of them going back to the day he moved in. We pulled the last 2 years of financials and started looking for the fine income line items. Here was the interesting thing. The fines were there, listed as standards enforcement revenue. But when we added up the fines that Phil knew had actually been collected from residents, just the ones he had direct knowledge of, the total didn't match. The number on the financials was lower than the total Phil had calculated. That was when Phil set his pen down very slowly and looked at me over his reading glasses. "Dan," he said, "I think some of those fines may not have been deposited." I asked him if he was sure. He said he wasn't sure of anything yet and we'd need more information, but that the discrepancy was real and significant enough to matter. He pulled out a notepad and started writing down the numbers carefully. The total from the reported financials for the last 2 years was around $1,400 in enforcement revenue. But between the 6 cases we knew about and whatever the actual per fine amounts had been, Phil estimated the real total was probably closer to $2,600 or more, and that was only counting the cases we knew about directly. The gap between those numbers was not a rounding error. I went home that night feeling like I'd started the week fighting a parking ticket and ended up somewhere significantly more complicated. I also felt, underneath all the stress and the cold and the general headache of the whole thing, a very strong sense that I was not going to back down. The next morning I took 2 steps. First, I formally requested a full accounting of all enforcement fines issued and collected over the past 3 years in writing from the HOA board. Under Pennsylvania HOA law, and I'd done some reading by this point, residents had the right to inspect financial records of the association. I cited the specific statute in my request. Second, I reached out to all 5 of the other affected residents and asked if they'd be willing to compile written documentation of the fines they'd paid, including dates, amounts, and copies of the fine notices if they still had them. Every single one of them said yes. The board's response to my records request came 3 days later, and it was from Janet, of course. She wrote that the request had been received and would be reviewed by the board at the next scheduled meeting, which was apparently in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, in the middle of a winter dispute with a pending fine on my account. I wrote back citing the specific provision of Pennsylvania law that required records to be made available within a reasonable time frame, and stated that 6 weeks did not constitute a reasonable time frame under the circumstances, and that I would be consulting with a legal advisor if the records were not provided within 10 business days. I did not actually have a legal advisor, but I had a brother-in-law named Gary who'd gone to law school and worked in insurance, and I figured he could at least point me in the right direction. I called Gary that night, explained everything, and Gary, bless him, spent 45 minutes on the phone with me going through the situation. He confirmed that the records request timeline was on my side, that the procedural violation on the fine was legitimate grounds for dismissal, and that if there was a genuine financial discrepancy in HOA accounts that suggested misappropriation, that was absolutely something that could be reported to the Pennsylvania Bureau of Consumer Protection and potentially to local law enforcement, depending on the amounts and specifics. He also said something that stuck with me. He said, "Dan, the thing about these small HOA tyrants is that they're used to operating in a vacuum. They do what they do because there are no consequences. The moment you introduce actual legal accountability, the whole house of cards shakes." He told me to keep documenting everything, keep all correspondence in writing, and not to say anything confrontational in person that couldn't be documented. I followed that advice to the letter. Meanwhile, the winter was not taking any days off. We had another storm roll in right around December 21st, a real one, about 8 inches overnight with strong winds that created drifts up against the houses on the north-facing lots. I spent a solid hour and a half clearing my driveway and front walk that morning, which was the kind of meditative activity that was great for thinking. While I was out there, I noticed that the shared path had been groomed again by Greenfield. Even in the storm, they'd been out early, and the whole thing looked like a pristine white ribbon running along the back of the neighborhood. It genuinely was pretty, and that made it simultaneously more infuriating that Janet had turned something nice into a weapon. My neighbor across the way, a younger guy named Tyler Marsh who'd moved in about 2 years ago and kept mostly to himself, came out to clear his driveway while I was finishing mine. We waved. He called over, "Did you get the thing about the path?" And I said yes, and he said, "Ridiculous." She also fined me in October for having a leaf blower running after 5 p.m. I paid it. I told him I was building a case and asked if he'd be willing to document that fine. He said absolutely, and asked what he could do to help. That conversation kind of opened the floodgates. Over the next several days, as people were out clearing their driveways and walks and running into each other in that way that only happens in a neighborhood after a big snowfall, I talked to more and more residents. The common thread was stunning. Almost everyone had a Janet story. Almost everyone had either paid a questionable fine or knew someone who had. The consensus was that people hated it but felt powerless, and that nobody had ever pushed back seriously because it just didn't seem worth the effort. I started keeping a running list. By the end of the week, I had documented 11 separate cases of questionable fines across a total of 9 households, spanning the past 3 years. 11 fines. Amounts ranging from $75 to $250. If even half of those had been improperly documented in the financials, we were talking about a significant discrepancy. Phil and I sat down again with the financials. The more we looked, the worse it got. The HOA financial reports were prepared quarterly, and they were not particularly detailed. Standards enforcement revenue was a single line item with no itemization. There was no way from the reports alone to tell exactly how many fines had been collected, at what amounts, and on what dates. That opacity was, in retrospect, almost certainly by design. I asked Phil whether he thought the missing money had been pocketed by Janet personally, or whether it was possible the reporting was just sloppy. Phil was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers, and then he said, "I think it's possible this started as sloppy record-keeping and became something more intentional over time. But I honestly don't know. That's not for us to determine. That's for someone with subpoena power to determine." He was right. We were not investigators. We were neighbors with spreadsheets and filing cabinets and a list of grievances. The right move was to escalate this to people who had the actual authority to dig into it. On December 27th, I filed a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania Bureau of Consumer Protection. Gary had helped me draft it over a couple of phone calls and one long email chain. The complaint outlined the pattern of fines, the procedural violations, the incorrect bylaw citations, and the documented financial discrepancy. I attached everything we had, all 11 documented cases, the financial reports, Phil's analysis, the correspondence with Janet, and the photographs from my original case. It was a 47-page submission. Phil printed out his own copy and kept it in one of his filing cabinets because of course he did. I also filed a separate formal complaint with the Maplewood Ridge HOA board itself, addressed to all 5 members and specifically not addressed to Janet, requesting an emergency board meeting to address the financial irregularities. Under the HOA's own bylaws, a financial irregularity complaint from a resident could trigger a special meeting if it was supported by at least 3 homeowners. I had 9 households ready to sign. We submitted the request with all 9 signatures on December 28th. Janet's response came within 2 hours, which was faster than any other response I'd gotten from her during this whole process. It was sharp, dismissive, and slightly panicked in a way that she probably didn't intend to show. She said the request for a special meeting was premature and without merit, and that the financial reports were accurate and independently verified. I had specifically asked in my submission for the name of the independent verifier. She hadn't provided one. I wrote back and asked again, specifically, for the name and contact information of the entity or individual who had independently verified the HOA financial reports. She didn't answer that one. Two of the other board members, a guy named Robert Haynes on Lot 19 and a woman named Sandra Cho on Lot 3, contacted me directly within the next 24 hours. Robert, who was a retired accountant, said he'd been uncomfortable with the financial reporting for a while, but had deferred to Janet on operational matters. Sandra said she'd had no idea the fines were not being properly itemized and documented. Both of them said they supported the call for a special meeting and would push for it internally. The special meeting was scheduled for January 7th, 2 weeks away. I spent those 2 weeks not exactly relaxing. The weather gave us another storm on New Year's Eve, a nasty one with sleet mixed in that made everything icy and miserable, and I spent the better part of New Year's Day chipping ice off my front steps with a flat-edged shovel and wondering what I'd done to deserve a neighborhood where someone would find me for boot prints. My propane was topped up at least. The house was warm. That felt like a small victory. During those 2 weeks, I also followed up on something I'd been meaning to do since the beginning of this whole thing. My house had a security camera on the back of the garage, angled to cover the backyard and the service easement. I'd installed it 2 years ago after a package theft situation in the neighborhood. I'd checked the footage from December 14th, the week this started, and I had clear video of Roy's entire visit. The truck arriving on the adjacent road, Roy walking to the tank via the service easement, him filling the tank, and him walking back. The footage was crystal clear, time-stamped, and showed definitively that Roy had walked along the easement, not on the shared path, and that he had been careful and deliberate in his movements. At no point did he step on the groomed path itself. I'd also noticed something else in the footage that I hadn't looked for initially. At approximately 2:15 p.m. on December 14th, about 45 minutes after Roy had left, the footage showed Janet Covington walking from the direction of the shared path toward the service easement area. She was clearly looking at the footprints. She stopped. She took out her phone and took several pictures. Then she walked back toward her house. It was deliberate and documented. She had gone out there specifically to photograph the footprints so she could issue the fine. That footage was going to be useful. I also got a call during those 2 weeks from a woman named Patricia Odom, who said she'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine what I was doing and wanted to tell me something. Patricia had served on the HOA board 3 years ago and had been effectively pushed off by Janet during a very contentious period. She told me that when she left the board, she'd noticed that the enforcement fine log, a spreadsheet that was supposed to track every fine issued and collected, had been moved from the shared board drive to a folder that only Janet could access. Patricia had said something about it at the time, and Janet had told her it was for confidentiality reasons. Patricia said she'd always been bothered by it but hadn't known what to do. I told her this was exactly the kind of information I needed and asked if she'd be willing to put that account in writing. She absolutely would. So by the time January 7th rolled around, I had the following in my corner: Phil's bylaw analysis, 11 documented questionable fine cases, the financial discrepancy analysis, the security camera footage from December 14th, Janet's documented failure to follow enforcement procedures, the support of 2 board members, 47 pages of filed complaints, and Patricia Odom's account of the fine log being hidden from the board. The special meeting was held at the neighborhood community room, which was essentially a converted garage at the edge of the development near the gazebo nobody used. It was small, maybe sat 40 people comfortably, and it was packed. I counted at least 25 homeowners, which out of 34 homes in the neighborhood was remarkable. People had shown up in the cold on a January night to sit in a drafty community room because they were done. Janet arrived last, 5 minutes late, which I don't think was an accident. She was dressed sharply, as always, coat perfectly pressed, and she sat at the board table at the front of the room with the calm, contained expression of someone who had decided that her best move was to project confidence. Robert Haynes and Sandra Cho were already seated at the board table along with the other two members, a mostly quiet guy named Frank Wallis and a woman named Deborah Huang, who I'd spoken to briefly once or twice, but who had generally stayed on Janet's side in board matters. I was asked to present my complaint. I stood up and spent about 20 minutes going through everything calmly and methodically. I described my original fine, the incorrect bylaw citation, the procedural violation, the footprint footage, and then I walked through the broader pattern, the 11 cases, the financial discrepancy, the inaccessible fine log, Patricia's account of the data being hidden. I had printed copies for everyone. I played the security footage on a laptop borrowed from Sandra Cho. The room was very quiet. When I finished, I sat down and there was a moment of silence that felt about 6 months long. Janet said, "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," in a tone that suggested she would rather have said absolutely anything else. And then she said that the financial reports were accurate and that any apparent discrepancy was the result of the standard calculation methods used in HOA accounting, which she declined to elaborate on despite Robert asking her twice to explain what that meant. Robert Haynes then did something that I think surprised even Janet. He said, very quietly and very clearly, that he had spent the past week reviewing the financial reports independently, and that the discrepancy was real, and that it could not be explained by any standard accounting methodology he was aware of. He said the total identified gap between reported fine revenue and documented fine collection was approximately $1,840 over a 30-month period. He said that he had, that same afternoon, contacted a certified public accountant in town to request an independent audit of the HOA's enforcement finances. Janet said that he had not been authorized to do that. Robert said he didn't need her authorization to contact someone for a quote on an audit, and that the full board would vote on whether to proceed. They voted right there. 3-2 in favor, with Frank Wallis breaking against Janet and Deborah Huang, which I hadn't expected but which Robert had apparently talked to Frank about privately beforehand. The audit was approved. An independent CPA would review the HOA's enforcement finances for the past 3 years. Janet said very little for the rest of the meeting. She sat with her hands folded on the table and said very little. She looked like someone who knew exactly what an audit was going to find, and who was doing the math in her head. My original fine was voided at that same meeting, by unanimous board vote, on the grounds of incorrect bylaw citation and failure to follow enforcement procedure. I didn't say anything when that happened. I just nodded and wrote it down. The audit took about 3 weeks. I won't walk through every detail of it because it's honestly a lot of accounting terminology that doesn't make for compelling reading, but the headline result was this. Over 31 months, the HOA had collected approximately $3,200 in enforcement fines. The financial reports had recorded approximately $1,350. The difference, just under $1,850, was unaccounted for. The fine log, which the auditor had requested, and which Janet had initially said she needed time to locate, turned out to exist in a slightly different form than expected. There was a spreadsheet, hidden in a personal folder on the shared board drive with a name that was deliberately vague. The spreadsheet showed every fine issued and collected, including the amounts. When the auditor matched those against bank records and reported figures, the story it told was not good for Janet Covington. Not all of the gap was explainable as simple deposits that hadn't cleared or timing differences. The auditor noted, in carefully worded language, that approximately $1,600 in fine revenue appeared to have been collected and not deposited into the HOA account, with no documentation supporting any alternative disposition. He recommended the matter be referred to law enforcement. The board voted on that referral in early February, and it passed 4-1, Deborah Huang being the lone no. A report was filed with the local police department's financial crimes unit. I heard about this from Robert, who called me to let me know, and I sat in my kitchen in the cold February morning with a cup of coffee and felt something complicated that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close to it. Janet Covington was not arrested in a dramatic public scene. Real life doesn't usually work that way. What happened was slower and more methodical. The police investigation took a couple of months. She retained an attorney. There were interviews, subpoenas, reviews of her personal bank accounts. By late March, she was charged with misappropriation of funds, specifically theft by unlawful taking under Pennsylvania law related to the undeposited HOA funds. It wasn't a massive criminal case. The amounts involved were not enormous, but they were real and they were documented, and the charge was real. She resigned from the HOA board the day the charges were filed, a resignation that was so overdue it felt almost anticlimactic. Deborah Huang resigned as well the following week, citing her desire to step back from community involvement, which I took to mean she didn't want to be around when the full picture became clear. In a genuinely surprising development, a number of the residents who had paid questionable fines were refunded by the HOA, funded through a reserve account that Robert had identified as having a sufficient balance. The amounts weren't life-changing, $75 here, $175 there, but it was meaningful. Carol Briggs, who'd been fined for tire tracks in her own driveway, told me she was going to use her refund to buy a really good bottle of wine, which seemed like an excellent use of funds. The HOA restructured the enforcement process entirely. Robert Haynes was elected board president at a special election in February with very little opposition. Sandra Cho became treasurer. They revised the bylaws around fine enforcement to include mandatory itemized documentation, a 2-signature requirement for any fine over $100, and a resident appeals process that was actually accessible and actually worked. Phil Davison was asked to help draft the new enforcement language, which he agreed to with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting 16 years for someone to ask. Marcus Webb, the guy who'd been fined for visible salt bags during an ice storm, told me at the next neighborhood meeting that he'd put a very large, very visible bag of ice melt right next to his front door for the rest of the winter, and he dared anyone to say anything about it. He said it with a big grin. Nobody said anything. Tyler Marsh, my neighbor who'd paid the leaf blower fine, got his money back and immediately went out and bought a louder leaf blower for fall, though he used it well within reasonable hours and documented that he did so, which he told me about with great pride. Janet Covington ultimately reached a plea agreement in June. She paid back the misappropriated funds in full with interest, paid a fine, was placed on probation, and received a permanent bar from serving in any HOA, condominium association, or other property management governance role in the state. Her attorney issued a statement that I assume she did not write herself, calling it a resolution that allowed all parties to move forward. I didn't think much about it either way. The outcome felt proportionate. The money came back. The rules were fixed. She was gone from a position where she could do more damage. Looking back at the whole thing, the part that I kept coming back to was how simple the original trigger had been. A propane delivery driver named Roy walked along a service easement in the snow and left boot prints. That was it. That was the thing that started all of it. And the boot prints were so clearly not a violation of anything, not of the spirit of the rules, not of the letter of the rules, not of any reasonable interpretation of community standards, that the fine had always been absurd on its face. But Janet had counted on me either not reading the bylaws or not caring enough to push back, and she'd been doing that calculation about her neighbors for years, and it had been working. The winter eventually gave way to spring, as winters do even when they seem like they might not. The trees along the eastern boundary of the neighborhood, the ones that had been bare skeletons over the shared path all those months, started to bud in late March and were fully leafed by May. The path, free of its groomed-in-January formality, became a genuinely pleasant place to walk. People used it with dogs in the morning, with strollers in the afternoon, with coffee cups in hand on weekend mornings. Phil walked it every day, 2 laps, at a pace that suggested he was in no hurry and had nowhere to be, which was exactly right. Roy from Valley Fuel Services came for a routine delivery in April. I was out in the front yard doing some early cleanup when he pulled up. He remembered me, and I walked around back with him while he checked the tank. He said he'd heard through another customer that there'd been some drama about his December visit, and I gave him the short version. He shook his head and said he'd been doing propane deliveries for 22 years, and it was the first time his footprints in the snow had caused an actual legal case. I told him I hoped it would also be the last. He laughed and said he appreciated that, and that from now on he was going to wipe his feet before every delivery. He was joking. I told him his footprints were welcome any time. The shared path was resurfaced and cleaned up properly that spring with actual community input about how it should be maintained going forward. There was a neighborhood meeting about it, a real one with actual discussion, where people talked about what they wanted the path to be and how they wanted it maintained and what the standards should actually mean. It was remarkably low drama and resulted in a set of maintenance guidelines that actually made sense and that everyone understood. Phil suggested we document it properly in an addendum to the bylaws. Robert agreed. It was done. I thought about what Gary had told me on the phone early in all of this, about small HOA tyrants operating in a vacuum, and how the introduction of accountability shakes the whole house of cards. He was right. It wasn't that Janet was some criminal mastermind. She wasn't. She was someone who had figured out that she could use a position of minor authority to collect money and maintain control, and who had done so for years because nobody had looked closely enough for long enough. The moment the scrutiny showed up and stayed, everything she'd built fell apart. That's almost always how it works with people like Janet. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a movie villain reveal, but with paperwork, with receipts, with somebody who went home and actually read the bylaws. I paid close attention to the new board for the rest of that year and the year after. Robert was steady and transparent. Sandra sent out quarterly financial reports that were actually detailed and actually itemized. The enforcement process was slow and fair, and when fines were issued, and occasionally they were issued for genuine violations, they were documented properly and accompanied by a warning first and a clear appeals path after. It was the way it always should have been. Phil and I had a habit of talking on Saturday mornings, sometimes in his kitchen over coffee, sometimes just leaning on the fence between our driveways. He'd been doing this kind of thing, holding neighbors and institutions accountable, reading the fine print, keeping the receipts, for a long time before I came along. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just thought it was important to know the rules that governed your life, and to make sure the people enforcing them were following them too. He was right about that. He's right about most things. The last time I walked the shared path, it was a November afternoon just before the first real snowfall of the new winter. The trees were bare again. The air had that specific bite that meant the cold was coming back for real, and the path was clean and quiet, and a little muddy at the edges from recent rain. I walked the whole length of it, about a quarter mile, and then stood at the far end near the old oak that had been there longer than any of the houses, and just took in the neighborhood for a minute. Houses with lights starting to come on in the early dusk, A kid on a bike making a last circuit before getting called in, a dog barking somewhere on the far side of the development. It was a nice neighborhood. It always had been, underneath everything. Next week Roy was coming back for the pre-winter fill. I'd be ready. The tank would be filled, the house would be warm, and if he left boot prints in the snow, I'd take pictures of them myself and put them in a frame. Some things you earn the right to find funny. The community came out of that winter stronger than it had gone in, and that was the thing that mattered most. Not the fine being voided, not the charges against Janet, not even the refunds. It was the fact that 25 people had shown up on a cold January night to sit in a drafty community room because they cared about where they lived and were done letting one person with a clipboard and a bad attitude define what that meant. That was the thing that stuck. The path was just a path. The rules were just rules. What mattered was the neighborhood, and the neighborhood turned out to be pretty good once the noise cleared. The shared snow path looked perfect that November afternoon, smooth and clean, waiting for whatever winter was going to throw at it. And this time, if anyone needed to walk across it to do something useful and necessary, they were welcome to. Their footprints would be fine.